Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. It's a membership organisation for animal studies scholars in Australia and around the world. I'm a member of ASA and I recommend the organisation to you. Now, this week on Knowing Animals, we're joined by John Simons. John is an Emeritus Professor in History, specialising in the history of animals. John is now retired, but most recently was Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Today we're going to discuss John's new book, Obaysch, a Hippopotamus in Victorian London, which has just been published by Sydney University Press, is part of the Animal Public series. So welcome to the podcast, John.
Thanks, Siobhan, and thanks for asking me.
Okay, John, so I've already messed up the name of a very important hippopotamus, but who we're going to learn a lot about today.
I hope so.
Can you start by telling us why you wrote this book?
Sure. Well, my work is, and has been for a number of years, about exotic animals in the British Empire and the circulation of animals around the British Empire. And Obaysch had a bit part in two of my previous books. And it really did seem to me that there was enough about Obaysch to justify an entire book just devoted to him, because as I claim in the book, he was the most important animal of the 19th century. And so he's worth study. And also, as I also say in the book, when you get these celebrity animals, there's actually as much biographical material to draw on as there might be for a politician or writer. So there's plenty to do to think about writing the life of an animal.
Wonderful. So can you tell us a little bit about what his life would have been like?
Sure. Well, of course, he was he spent a year as a wild hippo and was captured when he was probably nearly a year old. There's some argument about how old he might have been, but I think he was nearly a year old. And he was transported to London on a specially modified P&O passenger ship, and he arrived in London Zoo. He was an important animal because at this point London Zoo had almost gone broke, and the new what we now call the chief executive officer of the zoo, hit on the idea of having what he called a star animal, a different one every year. And Obaysch was the first, and the real significance of Obaysch was that he was the first hippo to have been seen in Europe, certainly since the Ice Age, but possibly since Roman times. The Romans may have had hippos here for gladiatorial games, but so he was a real rarity, and the logistics of bringing a hippo to London were quite daunting. They built a special house for him, and as you go through his life, you see how as he grew, because no one was quite sure how to look after a hippo, the minutes of the various committees of the zoo are constantly having to vote money to expand the hippo house, to build a bigger pool, to put heating into the pool, and so on and so forth. And later on, they actually managed to get a mate for him, which is another story.
So, in your view, was it a good life at the zoo?
No, I'm afraid it's a rather sad story, because the Victorian zookeepers were very conscientious, and they were good scientists by the standards of the day, and they did care about their animals, and they did try to look after them as best they could, but they really didn't know how to look after a hippo. So Obaysch died, I think he was about 27 when he died, and they thought that was a good age. Well, in fact, it's about half the age of a hippo. And also, as I studied Obaysch, I noted certain things about him that didn't quite add up, and I looked, finally, it took a while to source it, the post-mortem that was done on him, and it did actually confirm what I'd started to suspect, that he was by no means as well grown as he should have been for a hippo of his age, and that his skin was starting to crack and develop sores terribly, which was probably a function of being too cold. And the other problem, of course, for a hippo in the wild is that in captivity is in the wild, hippos are actually nocturnal, so they actually spend most of their day sleeping. But of course, he was almost artificially kept awake for much of his life in the zoo, so that people could see him, and vast numbers of people did see him. In the first couple of years he was there, hundreds of thousands of people came to see him, and they did turn round the fortunes of the zoo. The extra takings was enough to save the zoo and to provide money for investment in the next series of star animals.
So how did the community, the average zoogoer, receive him?
Oh, they were fascinated by him. I mean, it's hard to estimate today, I think, how important the zoo was, London Zoo was, as a social venue, and how important for very different classes of people a day out at the zoo was. So to see such a rare animal was not only terrifically exciting for people, but it was also terrifically important in the sense that we also need to remember that Obaysch's arrival in London corresponds with first of all the Great Exhibition. So he arrives in 1850. The Great Exhibition arrives in 1851, and so hundreds of thousands of people pour into London, and as well as seeing the Crystal Palace, they go to see Obaysch. But the second thing is, of course, we are here in what has been called the heyday of natural history, and for many Victorians many Victorians had adopted science as a study and as almost as a hobby and a pastime, and Obaysch, of course, was pored over by thousands of amateur zoologists.
So, given that people who came to see him would have learnt something about him and hippos, and I guess gained access to information that perhaps would have otherwise been unavailable to them or not as vivid, is there any justification in your mind to having a hippo in a say Victorian era zoo?
Well, I mean, like a lot of people, of course, I'm pretty torn as someone who's committed to the idea of animal welfare. Of course, I'm quite torn on zoos. I mean, my guess is that keeping a wild animal in captivity always involves a certain amount of cruelty, no matter how well you care for the animal. At the same time, there's no doubt that the good zoos do wonderful work in conservation, and that there would be animals today that would be extinct were it not for zoos. And also, one has to balance that cruelty with the importance of people actually seeing animals, and I think when people see animals, they think about them differently, and they might start to be more reflective about their own attitudes towards animals. So, although the fact of the matter is that Obaysch did not, I think, have a happy life, and there's lots of evidence, for example, that he spent a lot of his life in a furious, frustrated rages. There's also, I guess, an argument that, well, there was a scientific justification that people wanted to understand hippos, and in fact they did learn about hippos from Obaysch, and particularly from the offspring that he and his mate had over the years. And of course, by the end of the century, hippos are quite common in European zoos, and they are living more like natural lives, and of course actually beyond natural lives. I mean, nowadays it's not unusual for a hippo to live 50 or 60 years in a zoo. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know, but presumably it does show that they're being properly looked after.
So, quite a bit of your writing has considered human, non-human animal relationships in the Victorian era. I myself am very drawn to the Victorian era.
Yeah.
What is it about that time and the ways in which humans and animals were interacting that you find so fascinating?
Oh, well, I mean, I got into this. I mean, my early work on animals and animal studies was more general. But I wrote a book about 10 or 12 years ago about Australian animals in Victorian London. And that just happened to be about the Victorian period. And doing the research for that, I just realised that there was a whole world there that I knew not enough about. And so that's why. I also think, of course, I'm English by birth, and I grew up in a world which was still full of Victorian stuff, and I lived in Victorian houses. And so the Victorian era is part of my own experience. And of course, when I grew up, my very elderly relatives had grown up under in Queen Victoria's reign, so I actually knew Victorians when I was growing up. So I think it's really a combination of the fact that I, almost by luck, stumbled on Victorian animals and the amazing amount there is to say about them and think about them, and also my own biography of being English and therefore being partly still Victorian.
So you open the book with very moving and beautiful, but also, of course, very sad and distressing tales of animals and the way in which they come to be captive by humans.
Yes. And
you write that one of your ambitions is to put animals at the centre of their own narratives. Why is that important to you? Yeah,
that's great. Well, I'm very keen to remind people that we are dealing here with lived experience. The animal has a lived experience. It deserves to be given some agency in his or her own life. I think that's really important. I mean, although I was probably one of the earliest people in animal studies, I mean, there are people who say my book on animal rights and the politics of representation was almost the first big book in the so-called animal turn. I've never been entirely comfortable with a lot of what goes on in animal studies. I mean, it's a matter of what people do is up to them, but I've often felt that animals get so easily reduced to simply a term in an argument or a part of a chain of signification, and people forget that these are real things that deserve our consideration in a real way. And as a scholar, one way of doing that is by trying to actually put them at the centre, as I say, put them at the centre of their own story, and not to treat them as simply an effect of human experience.
So the book is beautifully written, and it's received a great deal of critical praise. It strikes me that one of the things you seek to do is write in a mode that's very accessible and pleasant to read, not kind of turgid kind of academic writing. Again, why is that a priority? Why write in that way?
Well, that's right. It's a long time since I've written. I mean, I started my life as a medievalist, so the first half of my career I was writing pretty hard-nosed philological stuff on medieval manuscripts, and so. But when I turned to animals, I think I realised two things. I mean, the first thing was that this was something I really cared about, and it deserved more than the very narrow audience that one is likely to get if one writes in a very conventional academic way. And secondly, it's just more fun to do that. And I'm not so naive as I think that there's ever going to be a mass audience for the sort of thing that I write. But I do feel that there is a little crossover audience who might get an insight into what we do in the universities around animals, and might might be educated by it, but above all, that they might actually start to think about animals in a new and more interested and, I hope, richer way. So yeah, I do try to write for this mythical, general educated reader.
Wonderful. Well, I can attest to it being very successful, and also I might add that the book is very reasonably priced, and as I say to listeners, if you can't afford to buy the book yourself, have a think about ordering it for either your institution's library or your local library, or indeed both. Well, John, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
It was probably... that's a very good question. It would have been one of the big books, like probably Peter Singer or someone like that, one of those early, more philosophical works about animal rights. Yeah.
Yeah, so another one for good old Peter Singer.
Yeah.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, it was a piece called The Longest Revolution, Cultural Studies After Speciesism. And it was a piece in a philosophical ethics journal. Can't even remember the name of the journal now. And that was the first time it had occurred to me that you could write about animals in that way. And it was out of that the book on the politics of representation grew. But it was that idea that you could actually use animals as a category for analysing cultural texts. In a way that hadn't occurred to me before, and that would have been about 24, 25 years ago.
Wonderful. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, on the philosophical side, it would either be Mary Midgley or Stephen Clarke. Both of them, I love the sort of the gentleness, I think, of their work. On the more cultural side, there are quite a lot. I really admire Carol Freeman's book Paper Tigers, which is about representation of Tasmanian tigers, and I've said to Carol myself, that's a book I would have loved to have written myself. I think Peter Tate's recent work on animal spectacles is excellent. I enjoyed that thoroughly. I think there's a lot of good work in the kind of history side of the history and cultural studies side of animals going on at the moment. I don't read the philosophical and welfare side and theoretical side very much nowadays. I've become pretty uninterested in that.
Well, a big shout out to both Carol and Peter, both of whom are absolutely wonderful scholars and both are previous guests on the podcast. So, John, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Oh, tell people why they matter. I think, we mustn't kid ourselves. I mean, it's very hard for us in universities to really achieve very much and to do very much. But I think what little we can do is about using our core activities, which is actually taking primary material and interpreting it for another audience. Is what we do, and I think that doing that with animals at the centre of that concern is very important, and really to show people, to display the shocking history of the way that animals have been exploited over most of human history.
So, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Oh, I wonder. I suppose I would want people to appreciate the fact that this is that going forward in time and space is a shared activity. It's not just about people with animals hanging around the outside, and to give animals more of a say, and actually to start to consider the experience of animals in the decisions we make. I remember a university I worked in about 20 years ago, and we were considering taking down some hedges and replacing them with a fence. And I actually pointed out at the executive that there were some birds that lived in these hedges and that they actually were part of the university's community. And I remember the Vice-Chancellor looking at me strangely. But that's what I mean. You have to think about those things. I saw the other day there's a golf club in Tasmania which is about to try to drive all the native animals off of the course because of because they don't want them on the course. They get in the way. I just think, oh, come on. Just play around them,
Absolutely, yes. I think they might have been defecating in the wrong places.
Well, they probably did, but,
Well, John, what are you working on next?
Okay, well, my next book is... Well, I have two projects. One is a novel which is written and is currently under being read by a potential publisher, and that's about... it's called The Penguin Digester, and it's about... it's a kind of historical novel about about Macquarie Island and the penguin oil industry, which people don't know a great deal about, and many other things as well. And that's written and is being considered at the moment. Then I've just had commissioned by Sydney University Press a book about Victorians and fish, and it's called provisionally The Goldfish in the Parlour. And because it strikes me that there's actually relatively little written about fish in animal studies, and that interested me to start with. Plus, as you will have gathered from other things I've said, the Victorians actually spent a lot of time thinking about fish, and there's an awful lot to explore and to share with people about it.
Wonderful. Well, I can't wait to read that book. I really look forward to it. So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, I have no social media presence, and that's a decision that I kind of made not to do that. So you can't look at a website. The only way you can really find out about it is to go on to Amazon or whatever and see what's available. I don't network. I very rarely attend conferences. So you just have to sort of depend on word of mouth, I guess.
Well, it's for that reason that I'm absolutely thrilled to have had you on the podcast. And I think that for anyone interested in the book, and hopefully everyone listening is, the way to do things is to go to the University of Sydney Press's homepage, particularly Animal Publics.
Correct. And
order the book there, or as you say, order it online through a seller such as Amazon.
That's right. I mean, it's... I was very pleased with Obaysch. I think it does look nice, as well as I was pleased with the book. But I think that Sydney University Press have done a really good job on the production as well. It's an attractive-looking book as well. So even if you don't read it, it's a nice thing to have on your shelf. Yes,
and it's got beautiful pictures and images inside also.
Yes, that was fun actually. Choosing the pictures was really good fun.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Siobhan. Great pleasure.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on social media, where we're very present at knowing_animals, or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.